Greetings everyone, and welcome to another one of Swedenborgian Community Online's book discussions. Well, I hope you all are doing well today. I'm excited to get into our second book discussion on The Universe and I, where science and spirituality meet, by George Dole. It's great to have a number of you in the chat. Welcome. I hope you're enjoying this book as much as I have. It's quite fantastic, and sometimes it's slightly hard to digest on first read, so I'm happy we have this opportunity to talk through it. I hope you enjoyed our first installment. Yeah, thank you for your greetings in the chat. I'm curious, what are you all thinking of it so far? I found it, as I said, a little tough to digest, as some of you mentioned, but also more digestible than most physics books. It's 100 pages, quite beautiful actually, very meaningful to me. And as I read through it again, having gotten the premise in my head, I feel like it's much easier to understand where he's going. And of course, as we talked about the first time, I love bringing into dialogue Stephen Hawking and these other physicists and some of their really deep, profound ideas, as well as how they went about expressing them and sharing them. So as we get started, let me know that you can hear me in the chat, and we'll start off by talking about chapter 2, what we can observe. So I find it interesting, this approach to George Dole, in terms of him kind of dissecting the current awareness and pop physics, and even very scholarly physics, by looking at the language we've used to talk about it, which makes sense in a way, but not something that most of us would think about, like dissecting some of the language we've used to talk about this. And yet it's kind of the point he's making, that if what the point of physics is to come up with this underlying principle that can be understood by everyone and can explain everything, then in a way it all comes down to meaning and language. And here he starts off by looking at the definition of life, because ultimately it seems like he's trying to come up, of course, with this some insight into how physics, how science can help explain all the emergent phenomenon in the universe, including life. And he looks at Webster's dictionary, and he talks about he quotes them saying the cellular biochemical activity or processes of an organism is the definition of life. And it goes on to say, as the ingestion of nutrients, the storage and use of energy, the excretion of wastes, growth, reproduction, etc. And he points out how that definition sits on the processes of life itself, or the activities. And to him, he says it sits somewhat uneasily with its alternative definitions listed in that book, I guess: a quality, a principle, or a state. So yeah, that's interesting. The key definition has to do with kind of the emergent things around it, its activities, its processes, and then of course it lists a quality, a state. But I think what he's getting at is it really getting to the heart of it? And he says it's one more piece of evidence actually that shows our ignorance. And I think I can digest that. That makes sense to me. And he doesn't really have an issue with us using these activities or processes of a thing to define the thing itself. In fact, the only thing he brings up is that he doesn't want it to go unnoticed, that's what we do. And he says that it's entirely consonant, as he puts it, with this principle of model-dependent realism that we talked about in the first video, and he describes, which is also called the appearance of truth that we're all in, according to Emanuel Swedenborg. So we create these models dependent on the things we see, hopefully as logically and relevant and real as possible. And that's what we have to do. None of us individually or perhaps even collectively have an objective view of reality. We each have a subjective view. And we should lean into making that view more and more realistic, more truthful, have more truthiness, as it's put, to be a better appearance of truth, to be a better sense of reality, but we're never the ultimate truth, as he talks about in that early chapter. And he says we can make coherent and productive inferences, even about life and consciousness. For example, it makes sense to me to model life as some kind of energy, because we see bodies activated when life is present. And we see them inert when it is absent. Switch off the current, and the motor stops. And he goes on to define the purpose of this book, tying it into this idea that life could be defined as an energy or as an emergent phenomenon, as we'll see. So he says, likewise, we can observe how both we and the universe behave, and we can come to well-informed conclusions about why the two of us exist. That is what I'm trying to do. So we have the purpose here. He's trying to observe how we behave, why we exist, why everything exists, as we talked about. And in the rest of this page, he lists these names of famous physicists or people who've discovered or uplifted a certain idea, phenomenon in nature, in the emergent universe. And he says he's going to go through these ideas in chronological order, and not in terms of when they came out, but in terms of when it happened in the history of the universe. So he starts with the Big Bang. And he talks about how, initially we have all these primal particles, and he calls it an utterly messy plasma. And I think he's quoting part of that from the physicists that came up with this idea. And even from the first moments, our universe moved towards creating relationships, they say. So of course we had these observations in the history of physics that could look far enough away that we knew it was coming from billions and billions of years ago, like we knew how long it took to get to us. And we could observe some of the details of the early universe, and it's this plasma, it's this pretty much uniform plasma of the simplest particles imaginable. And we can see some of the evidence for that, which is like the microwave background or something like that. And the moment those particles show up, they start forming relationships. So the physicists who describe this process describe that. So that's kind of amazing that the first thing you have is these relationships forming. And as we know, eventually we have all these different you could call them higher order particles that have different properties that interact with each other and come up with more and more beautiful phenomena, including life. Now, what's interesting is George Dole looks at what they say and he uplifts like the beauty of their concept, but he also has an issue with how they put it later when they say this organization that many physicists will say is fundamental to the universe, this tendency towards disorder, quote unquote, accidentally fluctuated. And these greater phenomena started almost immediately. Well, I'm glad it keeps accidentally fluctuating in such a beautiful way. And that's the thing that doesn't sit right with him, which makes sense. I mean, I guess we could say it's all accidental if that's our worldview. But I think his point is we're not looking at the fundamental principles of the universe if we just dismiss these higher order dynamics and relationships as accidents continuing, cascading into so many improbable, impossible things that allowed for life. And physicists will point out a lot of the improbable, impossible things in this universe, which is part of the reason why many physicists believe in infinite universes, because you have to have like a infinite, rolls of the dice to get something so perfect. But there's actually no evidence for that, as far as I know. Physicists usually don't point to evidence of it anyway. And So that means it's a belief. It's a belief that many people who love science have, and I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that belief. Now he then goes on and brings up some people he does agree with. And before I move on to what they said, I'm curious what you all think in the chat see, or if anyone wants to call in, please do. Yes, good evening, everyone. I hope you're well. I hope your families and connections in your life are well. As we're learning, it's all about relationship and creating higher order functions and communities that hopefully bring more and more, higher order functioning, more proliferation, better systems that uplift the already existing ones. So let me know what your thoughts are whenever you get a chance. And so he quotes these physicists that he says, bless their souls, they face this problem squarely. And he says they argue for an evolutionary paradigm in which there are, quote, isolated systems that evolve to disorder and open systems that evolve to higher and higher forms of complexity, unquote. Their model for the isolated system is the crystal, in which, quote, we can imagine each particle as imprisoned by its interactions with its neighbors, unquote, making the crystal relatively unresponsive to its environment. And then he says he'd note that the crystal seems extraordinarily stable, resisting any evolution toward disorder. So throughout this chapter, he highlights this tendency of physicists to say, well, things just go into chaos. And he's like, yeah, well, it seems like there's a high level of resistance to that chaos and a high order of these complex relationships giving forth to even more beautiful, complex, orderly, you could say, relationships. So that's interesting. Maybe that's why they keep saying disorder, because in each of these, leveling up from the smallest particles and on, you have more and more diversity. So you could look at that diversity and without really maybe thinking too hard on it or reading certain philosophers, I don't know, it's easy to say, oh, that's disorder. Look at all the disorder. But actually, I would think, reflecting on how all these things combine to create more and more beautiful things, and even the heavy elements that only came once we had giant suns that exploded. So, you could say phase 10 of the universe. Those are necessary for life on this planet. So you had to have this system, this cascading system of even the suns explode, the first suns dying in a sense, being renewed before you could have life. And so he's saying, that's not disorder. And this is maybe I'm reading into it, but that's not disorder. That is this higher order. And so he criticizes this idea of disorder. There seems to be this tendency for stability. Yeah, and so he does point out some things that are disorderly in a sense, or have a destructive quality at least. He talks about biodegradableness. Of course, there's death in the world of nature, decomposition, which in a sense is, for one, it's a decomposition, it's a death. For other beings, it gives them life, they feed off of it. It's interesting. You could sit on either side, and clearly this type of reproduction, these ending of certain modalities to give forth to others, is a big part of it. So you could say death is inherent for life, and nothing is lost, really. So yeah, so he also points to this model, called the Baynard cell, I think I'm saying that right, for this open system, and how these systems tend to self-organize. And this Baynard cell, apparently, if you run a convection current through it, these molecules, and I don't know if it's a living cell, I think it's just a layer of fluid, as he mentions. So it's heated, but it's called a cell. It's heated, and it creates this order, how is it put? Self-organized stability of a whole. So all these molecules, when they're heated, they come together and they work together, they become one. And so I find that interesting, that maybe like this tendency of energy, this propitiation in the universe leads to orderliness, leads towards these cells, maybe kind of naturally. And he points to these physicists talking about it and how they characterize the Baynard cell as an example of quote-unquote spontaneous self-organization, which leaves him wondering what they mean by the word spontaneous. And so he looks up the root of spontaneous in Latin, of course. I should mention, I know we talked about it in the first one, but George Dole is the translator of a lot of the modern day Emanuel Swedenborg books, because Swedenborg wrote in Latin, and he also, he has these degrees and all this history and language. George Dole does, or I should say Reverend Dr. George Dole, and of course he goes back to language. But I think that's helpful when it comes to talking about something we can all digest and agree on, is looking at definitions. And maybe that's what makes this short book somewhat dense, so worthy of a conversation, but also like it makes sense. It's like, oh, well, I can go on the next page after that and feel okay about what's going on. And so he looks at this definition of spontaneous, and it says arising from one's own free will. Interesting. But when used to describe inanimate events, Webster tells us, he says that it means having no apparent external cause or influence, occurring or produced by its own energy, force, etc., self-acting. And he says he can only take this as a metaphor because in the same category as the cooperation of a vast number of molecules, describing it in this way is talking about like humankind or life, or cells, like cooperation, self-acting. So he finds it interesting, the use of language here. And I think we have a comment, let me see, about the book. Albert says, that same dictionary also says that a miracle is an event or action that apparently contradicts known scientific laws and is hence thought to be due to supernatural causes, especially to an act of God. Interesting quote from that dictionary. Maybe some of you will comment down the line in the podcast views or listens and the YouTube views that maybe we should look at another dictionary. Well, maybe. He does look at some of the, like the Latin, so I don't think that's lost on him either. It's interesting that language always comes back to human experience and this kind of qualitative, you get what I mean, like even in the dictionary, right? It's kind of funny. It all comes back to the heart of what it means to be human, in a sense, this metaphor, this interpretive lens. And we take a lot of things for granted, and then we describe scientific things based on that language, and we try to get it right. We write, and Stephen Hawking writes books on it, and or used to in this world, and then we see that it still kind of hinges on this human experience, emotional, almost cooperative approach to even understand the laws of physics. And as George Dole highlights in those early chapters, this tendency to define things, and early in this chapter, by their laws, is something that we can't escape, but we shouldn't think that the laws themselves are the phenomenon, because in fact the laws are just as a physicist would put it, model-dependent realism or description of what we observe. And that has to do with a lot of different factors, not just our minds, but the tools we use, etc. So he goes on to talk about how these physicists start talking about the nature and the propensity of these cells, and also that they're not purely self-acting. There's these external influences that impact them, and that is a big part of why they behave like they do. And so he asks this question, like, what's keeping these things on track? What's coordinating these presumably mindless molecules, as he puts it? what instant after instant keeps giving this specific form to the convection current. And he talks about how, starting with this Big Bang, we have this, we have no suggestion of a constraining environment in the case of the Big Bang, but once they form and they aggregate, then we do have boundaries. But in a sense, the constraining environment, in my mind at least, would be the nature of those particles. So we know that they're very fundamental particles, so it's not like oxygen interacting with hydrogen yet, right? Like, these are even more fundamental than that. And so their nature, whatever the physical laws that describe, usually it'd say govern, right? Describe how they like to behave, that's a limiting factor, what they tend to do. They don't jump from, the plasma, we don't jump from the plasma to high order functioning. So in a way, you could say one of the key behaviors of early plasma is that they're highly differentiated and limited. So I guess in a way I'm somewhat disagreeing with George Dole here, but I think the only reason I could even think that is because of things he said on these other pages. So there you go. And then he says the primal motion toward creating relationships seems to have progressed inexorably from the simplicity of helium to uranium and beyond. So he highlights this propensity of the cascading effect of complexity, as we talked about. And then it's interesting, so he quotes Terence Deacon, who writes about these tendencies and how, things seem to be rolling along like clockwork and creation, like you have the Big Bang and you have this and this and this and this and this. And I think George Dole would say a lot of physicists mention this kind of thing. But once life starts, it's called an about face. Like, things suddenly become weird, is what this Terence Deacon writes. And how these principles of like this disorder and all these things, it tends to twist once we get life. But I think if you're following the conversation, it seems to, in the book, seems to be, no, it's not an about face. It seems to be right on course, which is amazing. You may disagree. Share your disagreement with us. We'll talk about it. And actually, we have some other comments. Let's hear them. So, Albert says, of the multitude of hopes and yearnings, I think he's quoting something. We'll find out. Of the multitude of hopes and yearnings we experience, two seem to subsume the others. One of these might be called the yearning to be included. Oh yes, from the book. To be a part of, close to, join with, to be held, admitted, accompanied. I see. The other might be called the yearnings to be independent or autonomous, to experience one's distinctness, the self-chosenness of one's directions, one's individual integrity. That's Robert Keegan, actually. I don't know if he's quoted in here. He must be, because I heard something very similar in this book. Yes, this good highlight, Albert. Thank you. A big point of this book, a big reoccurring theme, is this idea of being integrated and also being distinct, and like it's this like almost these like polar ends of creation in a sense. This like limiting factor, and yet this emergent, like we are awesome and there's infinite possibilities and we're community and we're doing all this stuff. Like the propensity for both is like this like balancing act that almost like holds us in creation and allows this emergent phenomenon. Excuse me. And that's from the Evolving Self, Problems and Process in Human Development by Robert Keegan. And Albert also quotes, I always say his name wrong, I shouldn't, Lao Tse. If there is to be peace in the world, there must be peace in the nations. If there is to be peace in the nations, there must be peace in the cities. This is from the end of the chapter, isn't it? If there is to be peace in the cities, there must be peace between neighbors. If there is to be peace between neighbors, there must be peace in the home. If there is to be peace in the home, there must be peace in the heart. Yeah. And it's interesting that this emergent phenomenon almost allows for the peace. It's like, once you're able to kind of enact your love, your propensity, and create something greater, almost like the image of what's within to the outside, then you find more peace within, because then that love is proliferating. And the more that love is aligned with kind of like the fundamental love of this emergent, diverse world, which I would think is diversity, maybe community, connection, as we see from the Big Bang on, the more your heart's oriented that way, maybe the more peace you have. Thank you, Albert, for that quote. Yeah, so, if we're going to take something away from this book, maybe let's look at our hearts and how much are we about these higher order process, this community building for greaterness, the infinity of creation around us, instead of maybe more of the isolationist, like it's only me, and this kind of inward turning versus outward growth. Yeah, so he criticizes this, I criticize works. He criticizes this idea of that life is this turning. He disagrees, and he goes on to say, quote how I think it's Deacon who says, the appearance of life or of mind has a quality unprecedented, a discontinuity to it versus what came before, and he calls that extreme language. Positive extreme language. And then he highlights how Deacon discounts that idea. And we talked about this in the first video, but often it seems in Georgia Dole's view, physicists will have a really positive view of something or a certain idea of something and then discount it because it doesn't exactly fit with the type of language I would think that we tend to use in science. And yet they can't help but come back to it. And so he says, he discounts that idea, and he says, he quotes Deacon, but just being the first instance of something or being novel or unpredictable are not particularly helpful distinctions. Being unpredictable, even in some ultimate sense, is only a claim about the limits of representation or of human intellect. And I'm going to keep reading. He notes the inadequacy of our present state of science and goes on to say, but we do not need to explain how such phenomena can exhibit causal organization that is superficially, at least, the inverse of the pattern of causal organization, which is otherwise ubiquitously present throughout the inanimate world. By the next page, the most radical contortion of the causal fabric of the universe has become merely a superficially inverted form of causal influence. Yeah, so he highlights that there's this big difference between calling this phenomenon radical and then a couple pages later saying superficial. And he says there is, I believe, more than a 3-page difference between radical and superficial. Yeah, and he's doing that really just to uplift how radical it is, or how we shouldn't discount these things just so we don't have to explain them in a way. Because he says, besides those comments, and Deacon's book is, or his subtitle is How Mind Emerged from Matter. So a physicist's book, let's see, it's called Incomplete Nature, by Terence Deacon, How Mind Emerged from Matter. He only treats of that subtitle in those few statements. And George Will says the rest of the book is either prelude or postlude. So, yeah, it's like, high-minded idea on the front. The book is either like the prelude or the postlude to it. It's like not really described. And he says, perhaps I should not have been surprised that the epigraph of this chapter in Deacon's book is a quotation attributed to names I can't really say. We need an account of the material world in which it isn't absurd to claim that it produced us. And George Will says, I cannot help reading that subtitle less as a description of content than as a veiled statement of intent, a candid announcement of the conclusion which determines what the reasoning shall be. And I'll just try to say those names. Prigogine and Stingers. He's saying that this is the intent of the book, to account of the material world in which it's not absurd to claim that it produced us. So he's saying, there's something strange about having this idea for what you have to say in the book, and from scientific perspective, like you have your hypothesis or your idea, but you shouldn't, what you write in your science shouldn't automatically fit that. Like it should be based on what you're observing and what's going on. It's a hypothesis, not a foregone conclusion, I think is the criticism. And then we have a quote from Swedenborg in the Chatsi, from Elbert as well. For anything to be produced, there must be two forces, one called active and the other passive. One without the other does not yield anything. And that, I think that connects with the kind of the polar ideas of differentiation and universal, or higher order, that we were talking about earlier. This energetic imagery can be recognized in another, slightly different statement of Swedenborg's active-passive principle. There are always two forces that hold anything together in its coherence and in its form. That is, a force acting from the outside and a force acting from the inside. Where they meet is the thing that is being held together. Yeah, and that comes from later when, George Dole is exploring this idea of more, on this idea of these outward factors being so essential to what comes about, but also this inward propensity. So there is this propensity, there is this self-acting that's almost like free will, even in particles, and we call it energy, right? But how does the energy show up? Well, through these certain ways of interacting that, depending on the particle itself, it has certain propensities, and it doesn't have to act in a very specific way even within those propensities. It has a level of free will even there, but it's limited by its propensities and its environment. And we'll talk more about that in a second, I think. So then he brings up Dawkins, which is good, a name we think about when we think about evolution and life. And it says he characterizes the emergence of life as a chemical event or series of events whereby the vital conditions for natural selection first came about. Well, this may be a widely held opinion. It has also been called into question by at least one of Dawkins' predecessors and several of his contemporaries. So I guess George Dole doesn't quite agree. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin argued more than 50 years ago that in the world, nothing could ever burst forth as final across the different thresholds successively traversed by evolution, however critical they be, which has not already existed in an obscure and primordial way. Which is an interesting idea. So who is Pierre Teilhard de Chardin? He wrote The Phenomenon of Man, and another somewhat contemporary book on the emergence of life and humanity, and ties into physics, I think, and especially evolution. Yeah, so it's interesting that this idea that, okay, so this propensity to these higher order functions, it has to be somewhat inherent in what's already there. So even, let's say, at the first plasma, the Big Bang, these propensity, what does he call it? Nothing could ever burst forth as final. So he calls it, he's essentially saying the propensity of the things themselves, like how they behave, which hasn't already existed in an obscure and primordial way within it. So even in the plasma, there's this primordial, obscure propensity towards what it becomes, and then what it becomes, and then what it becomes, and then even life. So in a way, he's saying, okay, well, there's this propensity of life in this maybe hard to find or obscure way, even in the smallest things in the universe. And then he also quotes Stuart Kauffman, who writes that a growing number of scholars are suggesting that even the abiotic world exhibits astonishing self-organization. And Thomas Nagel argues for a cosmic predisposition to the formation of life, consciousness, and the value that is inseparable from them. All right. So fundamental consciousness on every level of the universe. And skipping down, George Dole makes a comment about something he finds quite fascinating, and it's that this differentiation seems to be controlled by the position of the cells in the embryo. And I'm going to take that and kind of enlarge it. So the differentiation depends on where it shows up, and these things are created, especially in a cell, kind of differently depending on what's next to it. So it's like, oh, we have enough bone here, so I'm not going to be bone. I could have been a bone cell, but instead I'm going to be this other cell. And we see that not only in the embryo of Well, yeah, in all stem cells, actually. So I think that's pretty cool. Kind of like where you show up in community, you kind of find a place, and you have some freedom. But how would that apply to like the early universe? Maybe one of you tell me. Moving on. Yeah, so he spends a few pages on differentiation and how these things, this kind of phenomenon of placement occurred. And then he gets to Robert Keegan and this quote of his: "Of the multitude of hopes and yearnings we experience, two seem to subsume the others. One of these might be called the yearning to be included." And I read most of the rest earlier from Albert, I believe. Yeah, so this tension of wanting to be included, but also wanting to be admitted and accompanied in community. Or, no, wanting to be included, that is the accompaniment, but also wanting to differentiate, to be distinct, self-chosen. Feeling like, okay, this is me, I'm doing great, like, it's from myself, all of it. There's a tension there, which seems to allow for this emergent universe in a sense. Yeah, so what else does George Dole have to say about this? I think this is a key theme that he keeps going back to. Well, jumping to page 31, if you're not following me exactly, at least in this version. Sorry if you have another one. He talks about how, at the bottom, he talks about how the fine detail in creation in all its different forms is actually expressed in the combining of those forms into ever larger, more intricate, and more visibly complex wholes. So, in a sense, like, the greater these wholes, the more fine-grained the detail within them. He says it's expressed in the combining. Huh. That's a thought to meditate on, I think. But I think it's a key point he wants to make. And he says, "I am reminded of Swedenborg's lovely description of the most perfect form of human community." Quote from Swedenborg: "The more people there are, the more there is a shared motion toward oneness among them, and they are therefore joined together more closely and harmoniously. The harmony and consequent joining together increase as the numbers increase, because each new constituent there is placed between two or more others in order to connect them together, and therefore the new element provides strength and connection." The metaphor comes to mind, George Dole says, of a photograph being shown first at such low resolution that it is little more than a blur, with the resolution very gradually improving until it is possible to see an intelligible image and discover that what appeared as a turbulent mass of motion was in fact a group of individuals engaged in a coordinated activity. So in a sense, yeah, early universe is like the blurriest image possible. And then as we move forward, we're shaking that photograph, and we're seeing what it was all about from the beginning. We just hadn't shaken the photograph enough, or hadn't given it time. It's interesting that time is, of course, a key part of the process, and you can't really differentiate process and time, quantum physics or anything really. Like, that's what defines time, is this movement of processes. So as complexes keep combining to form larger and ever more complex complexes, the fundamental creative tension of life itself remains constant, George Dole writes. Huh. Yeah. And then we get the quote that Albert so wonderfully gave us from Lao Tse earlier about peace. When I read this recently, it was harder for me to place this quote into the theme of the chapter. This is the last part of this chapter. But I remember when I read it the first time, it seemed to fit beautifully. Or maybe I just really liked it. But we talked about it earlier, how this propensity of peace cascades. And in fact, especially, you look at home, then you look at peace in the body and then peace in the heart. In a way, the higher, the more complex form allows for more peace in the body, right? Like the reason we build a home. The reason we build a body, you could say, is for peace in the heart. I don't know. But definitely if you have more peace in the body, the more peace in your heart. Or in your mind, you could say. But then you have these higher and higher forms that allow for maybe greater peace at home. But he also said, he's saying it the opposite way, like peace in the heart helps give forth to peace outwardly, outwardly, outwardly. And in fact, that is a key phenomenon. It's this like holographic universe we live in. So let me check, see if there's anything else in the chat. See, what do you all think of the format of this conversation? I hope you're enjoying it. You know, I think a lot of like book groups, it's nice to just step through and see what we get out of it. Just, you know, because it's hard to always digest these things upon first read. And I'm skipping the things I don't find to be super relevant or interesting, but you know, there's a lot of great things in here. So it's an emergent phenomenon. So I hope you're stepping with me and feeling good about it. So Albert says, a lumberjack and an artist walking through the woods together. Yes, this is a quote from, I remember it from the book. We'll see quite different things. In each case, the effort will be to relate the specific observer to the specific environment. The lumberjack may be thinking in terms of board, feet, accessibility, and marketability, while the artist may be considering patterns of color, tone, light, and shade. But the interaction of individuality and environment is essentially the same. Yes, indeed. Yeah, it's like depending on perspective and your mind. And I think that has to do maybe with something I skipped, but I think the next chapter. Excuse me. So chapter 3, emergence. And this, we've heard a lot about this already, but he's going into more detail and where it shows up with physicists already, and of course he explores his own thoughts on the matter. So he ties back into Swim and Tucker. He says they call attention to the delicate precision of balance between what we observe as the tendency of the universe to expand and the force of gravity that is constantly drawing masses toward each other. I just want to stop there for a second and talk about gravity. You know, it's interesting that matter, like, so the existence of stuff draws other stuff to it, even if it's far away. Like, in fact, it's hard to wrap your mind around, maybe it's just my mind, but a particle on like 1,000,000 galaxies away, like the farthest away you could imagine, and a particle on the other side, or even the entire galaxy on the other side, interact with each other. There's actually gravitational interaction according to physics. You know, maybe it's a cascading thing or a type of thing, but it's interesting that all matter gravitates towards itself, and yet we're expanding at this kind of beautiful rate to allow for not only this expansion but gravity to keep us together in such a way that we can walk on a planet, right? And so he quotes them saying, if the rate of expansion, if the rate of expansion had been slower, even slightly slower, even 1/1,000,000% slower, the universe would have recollapsed. It would have imploded upon itself, and that would have been the end of the story. Conversely, if the universe had expanded a little more quickly, even 1/1,000,000% more quickly, this is coming from those physicists, the universe would have expanded too quickly for structures to form. It would have simply diffused into dust, with no structures to bring forth life. What we've discovered is that we are living in a universe that is expanding at just that rate necessary for life to emerge. Wow. It's profound. And there's like I remember, you know, I had some science classes in my day. I remember a lot of highlights of certain things in the universe that are so perfect that, you know, if it's slightly off, the propensity of helium to blah, 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 you wouldn't have life, right? As far as we know. And I think that's amazing that we're in such a perfect universe in so many ways that one phenomenon could look impossible in a probabilistic sense. And I think that's why a lot of physicists and people believe in infinite universes. I think it's also a reason to look at the emergent principles of the universe and say, okay, what could be the reason for this? That's the point of this book, right? Yeah. So he says it's not enough to look at why we're expanding, but also why we're not flying apart. George Dole says that. The tension between the two opposing tendencies seems to be such that they cancel each other out except in that millionth of a percent imbalance, in which dominance swings back and forth between quantizing and aggregating. When there is compatibility between units, they form a relatively stable complex, which declares its independence, as the physicists put, or better, its interdependence, as George Dole puts. And by virtue of its accumulated greater mass, this complex exerts a stronger attraction, can thereby become part of a larger and more complex partnership. Yeah. And he goes on to say, that is not all that is happening, though, which is the main point made by P.W. Anderson when he writes, quote, the behavior of large and complex aggregates of elementary particles, it turns out, is not to be understood in terms of a simple extrapolation of the properties of a few particles. Instead, at each level of complexity, entirely new properties appear. Yeah, I thought that was amazing, that you have these principles on a fundamental level of each particle, and then as they build new things, it's not like you can just be like, oh, well, those principles, of course, you wrap them together, you get this other principle. No, there's no way to really understand why, but these new principles, or I guess we're trying to understand why, but these new principles appear on these higher level interactions. And so, like, why are these principles so cascading, so dynamic, so non-classical physics, where, if you knew the details of these, then you would know this, and then you know this, and you know everything, right? And you could tell the future even. But that's not how our universe seems to work. Instead, we have kind of a word that I think he delves into at some point, magical phenomenon, which is the reason he brings it up, of course, is because the physicists used it, right? So he goes on to say, for a metaphorical analogy, we might think of the way in which red and yellow combine to form not a plaid, but a single completely new color, orange. We did not get the properties of water, for example, by adding 2 measures of the properties of hydrogen to 1 measure of the properties of oxygen. I think that analogy works only if you don't think too much about the physics of color. But it works well enough, right? At the same time, no other combination of elements exhibits the same wondrous properties without which plants would not grow and blood would not flow. Yet as we move toward the larger and more observable complexities, we do find a holographic dynamic. This is Lao Tse's message. It is the message also of every cell in our bodies, each of which contains a kind of blueprint for the whole organism. Yeah, and he keeps talking about that, but yeah, I think that's amazing. It goes back to those quotes earlier, that there's like a blueprint within something, even if it's subtle, even if it's it's hard to find. There has to be this kind of propensity, this higher order, you could say, purpose, for something, in order for it to aggregate towards that, and then those things aggregate more towards it. It has to be like quite a phenomenal, amazing purpose of diversity and community and higher order dynamism, I think the word is, and what does that even mean? Like, where does joy come in? Where does love? And I think these things are somewhat hinted at in even these lower order functionings. The agreeing to come together and build something greater, to be not alone anymore, but as a greater whole, from an atom, right? From a certain perspective, is a whole, and yet you could keep dividing it up. Same could be said about the human body, of course, on a cellular level, or maybe even a functional, organal, level. Same could be said about a family, a couple, community, a world, a galaxy, maybe. I don't know. So, yeah, I think that's amazing. And then we have a perfect image of it, perfect analogy, a metaphor, or what have you, of it in a cell, is George Dole's point, that, hey, there's literally like this folded up really awesome, like almost mind-blowing thing in each cell. It's called your DNA. And if you were to unfold it, right, like as they say, it's like super long, wrap around the world a few times, right? I think that's amazing, if it's true. If it's not true, I think it's still a couple miles long. I'm trying to remember, all the times I've been, corrected in the past. So, yeah, so it's amazing. It's like there's like a hidden word in your cell that describes what it's learned so far and to all your ancestors and all the random changes and what's still working. And that book is read by every cell and checked, and it helps to produce more. But there's other versions of it, right? And it's interesting because that's a fundamental idea of the word in the world, according to Swedenborg, that Scripture comes to us in different forms depending on our community, depending on our history, depending on our life. It may not be a book, right? You may not call it Scripture, and you may not call it God. You may not call it truth, perhaps. You might call it science. If it's healthy science, I would say it's probably indistinguishable from healthy religion in certain aspects. In fact, they would definitely, if there's a Venn diagram, they would overlap, because model-dependent realism is the name of the game, as we've learned. Moving on. Unless there's a quote. No. Hope you all are doing okay in the chat. Jumping to page 40. According to Swedenborg, for anything to be produced, there must be two forces. One called, did I read that already? Oh no, that was, Albert quoted this earlier. Thanks, Albert. Yeah, it's such an important quote because it's highlighting in Swedenborg how this shows up in physics and all these other things. And one thing I've blown my mind with Manuel Swedenborg, scientist turned theologian, 18th century, mystic, put on trial for heresy because the church didn't like what he had to say. But he was a Christian, a mystical Christian, who thought you didn't have to be Christian to go to heaven. And it's interesting, like it's been mind-blowing for me that so much of what I read in science nowadays, Swedenborg was writing about in like fundamental levels. Even left brain, right brain phenomenon, as I think we'll run into, he was writing about in the 18th century, like 20, 30? I don't know when he wrote the book on that. Probably the 30s. Yeah, he had descriptions of psychology that were only been coming into now, certain modalities. And if you look up nebular hypothesis on Wikipedia, you'll see Swedenborg listed. It used to just list Kant and Laplace as coming up with the idea of how the solar system formed, nebular hypothesis. But now it has Swedenborg because he published the book under his name 30 years before Kant did, and Laplace. So I find it kind of amazing. And we know Kant read Swedenborg, but that's not what we're talking about tonight, exactly. And actually, the next page is the brain quote from Swedenborg. As Swedenborg observed, the brain itself is divided into two hemispheres. The right side has to do with the good. This is a quote from Swedenborg. The right side has to do with the good that results from truth, and the left to the truth that results from good. Or in other words, the right refers to the good that love can do, which leads to the truth of wisdom, while the left refers to the truth of wisdom that results from the good that love can do. Unquote, end quote. And George Dole says, in colloquial terms, the right side says that something feels right, the left side says that something looks good. Yeah, and he's highlighting this having to do with kind of like these two modalities of feeling and truthiness or looking, or this kind of more analytic view, and kind of like this internal propensity, this thing emerging from within, which I think you would say would be emotion, the right side, the heart, and then this external thing, which I think you would say the left side of the brain, the truthiness. My truth is truthiness, right? The appearance of things. And so Swedenborg, I think, is saying, well, I don't need to go into that right now. All of it, I think, is saying, there's this propensity towards being led by both, and it's where they come together that we have like true emergent phenomenon and life. Not to say if you lose part of your brain, which we've seen, your brain doesn't still work and you're fully capable human being or anything like that, but that our brain has like an image of this phenomenon for good reason, and it adapts if things change. But this occurs in all levels of creation. It's quite amazing. And then in his footnotes, we haven't been too deep in the footnotes this time. As we talked about in the first video, a lot of his like little witty stuff, comments show up in the footnotes. Although I think in this chapter he just put it in the chapter to some degree. But here he says in page 43, footnote 19, on the personal scale, I have in mind particularly an exegesis Swedenborg offers for the word adjuvere, to help, in his index of Isaiah. He says, Swedenborg says, in its outer sense, it is for people to whom it seems that their own efforts contribute to their reformation in an inner sense, or to the Reformation. In an inner sense, for people who demand something of themselves for their regeneration, in a still more inward sense, for people who know in theory that they are capable of nothing but still think they are somehow involved, and in the inmost sense, for people who claim no credit whatsoever for themselves. And I think this is in reference to perception and purpose-driven. So kind of this duality of, okay, is it from within, is it from without? And what comes up to him, like this relationship between free will and determinism, all these kind of dualities, like I think he's saying are inextricably, and I should write that down and say it again, linked, and that it has somewhat to do with kind of this spiritual process in our own lives of coming to some realization that it all comes from this higher order thing, the universe, the Lord, the Lady, Sophia, divine love, divine wisdom. And in our own realization and in our own spiritual journey, if we're becoming healthier, I think is what he's describing. At first, it seems like it's just us, and at least we're trying to be reformed is kind of that first state. And then we still demand something from ourselves, but we know it's from something greater, and eventually we know that it's all from God, even though it often seems like it's us, it feels like it's us. We know that, in fact, all the things that are working for us, not in like, oh, I'm different than God way, but in a more like, oh, I accept that actually the Lady is working within me, and that all my strength, all my wisdom, all my love is from God, and I should lean into those healthy behaviors from God, and accept, the Lord leading me, accept the change that divinity is calling upon me, and look at the universe the same way and see it in other people, uplift it in other people, in their thinking and their living, and continue this emergent phenomenon of these higher order communities creating something even more beautiful and mind-blowing. We've seen it on all these levels before, all these mind-blowing things, impossible. Well, even if we're one of a trillion universes, we're apparently in the miracle universe, right? So let's look for the miracles we can make in community, because they're going to happen one day on some planets if we don't destroy ourselves. So, hey, it's right at our fingertips, and it's what we see on every level of creation. You don't have to believe in God to believe in that, right? You can just accept that, hey, every level of community has its miracles for the next higher order thing that lets that community proliferate and be amazing. So let's accept that and get over our scarcity mindset, our pressure and pain that we put on other people, and because it's not just the mindset of folks that bring scarcity, it's the fact that this society is built on like scarcity as like a leveraging tool, and we create so much in the United States, for example. We create so much, and we're the most productive we've ever been, and wages have been stagnant since the 90s. I mean, is that trickled down, or is it everything just flows to the top? I think it's how our system is built. You can look at the bylaws of publicly traded companies to get a sense of why. The rules of the SEC, you have to maximize shareholder return in terms of capital. We don't care about the return on our labor capital. You put your life in, you don't necessarily get a return. You get your stagnant wage, but there's no value attributed to that gets a return. And so we see all the money go to the people who provide capital, which are people with capital. It's rich people, and nothing against them, but we could all be living, even them, in ways beyond our imagining, if only we weren't so scarcity bent. And that's my 2 cents here towards the end of the chapter. If you have any comments, please share them in the Chatsy or in the discussion forums. If you're not live, I keep mentioning Chatsy, but you can comment in the YouTube comments and I'll reply, someone will reply. In the podcasting, it's tougher, and I know there's a lot of you podcasters out there. Go to our website, you can send me an email, and you can comment in the chats even in the off hours. I know it's kind of dead sometimes because no one's hanging out every day for every second, which is why the forums are so great too. All right, yeah, so please comment. I'd love to hear more voices than mine, and I love that you do share. So what else does he say about this? Yeah, so he it's interesting, so I'll just read it. Reality does not so much cause me to perceive as set limits to what I can perceive. And he quotes here, the basic design of reality calls for the thinking mind to flow into the sight. This is Swedenborg. Subject to the state imposed on the eyes by the things that are being seen. A state which that mind further organizes at will. Likewise for the intuitive mind to flow into hearing, subject to the state imposed on the ears by what is being said. And then George Dole says, you limit what I can see because I cannot see through you. Within those limits, though, I have a very significant latitude as to focus and interpretation. Yeah, so this room is the light, a very small fraction of the light is hitting my eyes, going through my eye actually, and hitting my retinas or whatever, and then my brain's like taking those signals and is interpreting it, and then not only that, but then I interpret that for meaning, right? And of course we see what happens when people lose their ability to interpret those things. Hearing, I was watching this amazing video from Vox about music and how you can lose your ability to hear beat, hear certain tonalities in their harmonious state, and like to lose your ability to hear music. And so it's kind of amazing. Yeah, everything is from our subjective perspective. We interpret it. And so where's he going with this? According to this model, it is not just that light rays flow into my relatively passive eye, I actively look. Sight is, so to speak, the interference pattern occasioned by a subjective energy meeting an objective energy, a mind putting forth salience that encounter constraints. The mind will adjust to these constraints, focusing on those features that it regards as most relevant. He's using some terms that we haven't heard from him before, partly because I skipped his, I think, explorations of some of that. And what he's saying is, yeah, we have this subjective perspective, and it takes this emergent phenomenon for things to be realized, but even then, it's subjective, and we move forward in our limited scope. And that's where Albert's quote of the lumberjack and the artist comes in. And then so he says from there, like, okay, he says, I understand the creative energy to be expressing itself in me most eloquently as the yearning for autonomy and the yearning for inclusion. So he's saying all this has to do with creativeness in a way, that we can't break from that mold, especially as human beings. And he goes on to say, the restless creative motion of life itself is not only that I am constantly emerging is what I am. Anthropos is not a being, but a becoming. Not a snapshot, but a movie. Not a corpse, but a process. As God says, I am a living God, right? And in this model, it is at every moment a process involving the interaction and formation of both individuals and community. Wow. That's essentially the end of the chapter. And he's essentially saying that life is this movement, this emergent phenomenon, and it starts at the very beginning in a way, and it continues forward. All right. So that's chapters 2 and 3. I felt like I think he he lays out these concepts and he goes at them from different angles. He mentions them before he really gets to them. So we hear something about them even in this conversation, and then we hear more about it. But I think that's good because it's heady stuff, right? It's good stuff. And so next time in the second week of September, the second Thursday, I should say, we'll be talking about chapters 4 and 5. And I think this is a place where we can kind of wrap up. If you have any comments, please share them. We wrap up by uplifting community, because in a way that's what this book is actually about. Community and God, and saying that those are kind of interchangeable terms in a way. Healthy community is emergence of God. The community of the plasma is emergent of the next order particles that give rise to something even greater. And so leaning into community in its healthy states, that's not every community, and I'm not saying every you have to choose this community or anything like that, but leaning into your communities, uplifting its health, your own health as a bodily community, your familial health through whatever things that you come across. I would say that because it's on the fundamental level of this creation, and because this divinity, this universe is aware, this emergent divinity is aware and trying to uplift these things, we should accept where it speaks to us, where she talks to us, and that's different for each of us. I think often Scripture is a good way to check things, your Scripture, whatever that is. It's good to reflect, interrogate it, reflect our own intentionalities, our own dogmas especially, and how we're applying those in the world. It seems the more open and diverse we're allowing things to be, the more we're fitting these lower levels of the universe in our own way, right? And so maybe looking at where we're somewhat dogmatic, where we're somewhat unwilling to accept other people in their health. It's easy to say, oh, well, that's not healthy because it's not right. So I don't mean that. But looking at are they living, healthy in a more, let's say, a softer way, a more loving way, a more kind way, more open way, a more diverse way. As Swedenborg says in other descriptions of what it means to be great community and heavenly community, the more diversity, the better. And I know Paige and Albert and some of you mentioned that in usually the perfect moment. It's this diversity, it's this inclusion that lends itself towards perfection. I think often we think perfection, we think, okay, well, cookie cutter, all right, I'm leaning into this perfection. Well, that doesn't seem to be the case, whether it's a physics book you're reading or or a scripture of some kind. So let's accept that diversity, accept each other, uplift other people where you meet them, knowing that the emergent phenomenon of the universe, of God, of you, is present in them just as much as you, and that uplifting it in them and caring about it like you care for yourself, that's from divinity too, is the same thing. Otherwise we're hypocrites, right? Or I shouldn't say that. Otherwise, maybe we're not being as healthy as we could be, being as community-driven and loving as possible, as is the purpose of this creation, it seems. So thank you for connecting with us this evening, and I hope you join us for our Sunday and Thursday services down the line. My name is Reverend Cory, and you're with the Swedenborgian online community. Go forth knowing that you are quite loved.